Look at the room first, before anyone tells you what it means. It is a little before noon on the 9th of May, 1914, in an upstairs room of a Spanish-style winter house in the hills above Santa Barbara, California. A man is alone in it. He is 59 years old. He has just come home by private train from surgery in Minnesota that did not fix what was wrong with him, and he is one of the richest men in America. In a moment there will be a gunshot, and the servants will come up the stairs, and the man who built a fortune telling the country it could think itself well will be dead by his own hand. I have gone back to that room more often than I can easily explain because of what the man in it did for a living. His name was Charles William Post, and he had spent 20 years selling health. He sold a hot drink you could take instead of coffee and feel virtuous about. He sold a cereal he swore in print could help cure the sick. He had built one of the great American fortunes on the promise that the body answers to the mind, that a person could decide to be well. And then, worn down by a pain that surgery could not reach, he decided the opposite, and there was nothing his philosophy could do about it. Here is what waited at the far end of that fortune. A man who got rich fighting a doctor he first met as a patient in that doctor's own hospital. An only daughter who inherited an entire company at 27 and was not allowed to sit on its board because she was a woman. A marriage that put her in Moscow at the exact moment a communist government was selling off a murdered emperor's treasures for cash. The largest privately owned sailing yacht in the world, which the United States Navy took in wartime and turned into one of the first racially integrated warships since the Civil War. A palace on a strip of Florida sand between the ocean and a lake, left to the American government to be a winter White House. A government that gave it back, and a developer who bought it and who, as president, used it as a winter White House after all, exactly the way she wanted, and nothing like it. Every one of those things is documented. None of them is the reason people call this family cursed. This is the story of the greatest breakfast fortune America ever built, and the death and the curse that everyone says came with it. It is also the story of how a family with exactly one tragedy at the top of its bloodline became a legend of suicide and secrets, when the truth was one sick man who could not cure himself, and one daughter who spent the rest of the century turning cereal money into the closest thing this country has ever had to a crown. I want to start in that upstairs room and then leave it, because to understand why one gunshot became a curse, you have to understand the man and the strange thing he sold. Subscribing before we go up those stairs helps build a community around work like this and rewards the effort behind it. Chapter 1. The Room in Santa Barbara. Look at the room again now that you know whose it was. The house stood in Montecito, in the hills above Santa Barbara, where Charles William Post spent his winters trying to feel better. He had been ill for a long time. The nature of the illness is hard to fix precisely across 100 years and the polite language of the period, but the shape of it is clear enough. There was chronic stomach trouble, there was pain that would not leave, and there was something older underneath it, a low and recurring darkness that the medicine of his day called nervous exhaustion, and that he had spent his whole adult life trying to think his way out of. In the early spring of 1914, the pain grew unbearable, and he did the thing that rich and frightened men did in that era. He went to the Mayo brothers. His people put him on a private train and rushed him to Rochester, Minnesota, where William and Charles Mayo operated on him for appendicitis in the first week of March. The surgery was considered a success. The appendix came out, and the relief he had crossed the country for did not come. The pain stayed. Whatever was actually wrong with him, and there has been argument about that for a century, it was not the thing the knife had removed. He went home to Santa Barbara to recover, and did not recover. I want to be careful here, because this is the single darkest fact in the whole family story, and it is the one most often twisted. On the 9th of May, 1914, Charles William Post shot himself and died. He was 59 years old. The most reliable accounts describe a self-inflicted gunshot wound in his own home after months of illness and decline. Some tellings add the detail that the weapon was a hunting rifle, and I will name that only as a detail some sources give, because the specific gun is one of the places where the record gets shaky and the retellings get confident. What is not shaky is the fact of it, and the reason it matters so much to everything that follows. He was not murdered. There was no mystery about who was in the room. A man in great pain, who had been promised relief and not given it, ended his own life. That is a tragedy of the most ordinary and human kind, the kind that happens in families with no fortune at all. There is a bitter symmetry in it that is worth naming. The illness that finally overwhelmed him was, by the accounts that survive, tied up with his stomach and his gut, the very territory his whole health philosophy had claimed to master. He had built an empire on the promise that the right food and the right frame of mind kept the body in order. He had advertised a cereal that could supposedly guard against the very kind of abdominal trouble that now had him on a surgeon's table in Minnesota. The founder of a digestive health fortune, undone by his own digestion, is not a joke anyone should want to make. It is closer to a kind of grim proof, delivered on his own body, of the limits of the thing he sold. And this is where the legend gets it exactly backwards. This death was never a secret. It was in the papers. The New York Times carried it the very next morning. The founder of Postum, one of the most famous product names in the country, had died by his own hand, and the country read about it over breakfast, quite possibly over a bowl of his own cereal. Whatever else this family would later be accused of hiding, the founder's suicide was public from the first day. So hold both of those facts together, because the whole story lives in the space between them. One real, documented, deeply sad death, reported openly in 1914, and, layered on top of it across the following century, a legend of suicides and secrets and a cursed bloodline that the facts do not support. To see how far the legend traveled from the truth, you have to go back to the beginning, to a sick young man in the 1880s who decided that his own suffering was a problem the mind could solve. Chapter 2. The Sick Man Who Sold Health. Charles William Post was born in Springfield, Illinois, on the 26th of October, 1854. And for the first 30 years of his life, the most reliable thing about him was that his health kept collapsing. He was clever, restless, and mechanically gifted. He left the State University at Champaign after about 2 years without finishing, which was not unusual for an ambitious young man in a hurry in that era. He went into the business of farm implements, inventing and manufacturing plows and cultivators and harrows. He had a genuine talent for it. What he did not have was a nervous system that could take the strain. In the middle 1880s, under the pressure of the work, he suffered a breakdown, the first of several, and his body simply stopped cooperating with his ambitions. By the middle 1880s, he had moved to Texas to recover, tried real estate in Fort Worth, kept working, kept collapsing. By 1991, he was a sick man running out of options, and he did what a certain kind of desperate American did in that decade. He went to Battle Creek, Michigan, to the most famous health institution in the country, and put himself in the hands of Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. You have to understand what Battle Creek was, because everything about the Post fortune grows out of it. The town was the capital of the American wellness movement, and its cathedral was the Battle Creek Sanitarium. run by Kellogg, a brilliant and domineering physician who blended real medicine with vegetarianism, hydrotherapy, elaborate theories about digestion, and a deep moral conviction that most of what ailed modern people came from how they ate. Rich, exhausted, dyspeptic Americans checked in by the thousands to be fed bland, healthy food, kept away from coffee and alcohol and tobacco, and taught a whole philosophy of living. Post checked in as one more broken-down patient. He did not get well there. That is the first irony, and it is worth slowing down for, because the man who would sell the country wellness could not buy it for himself in the one place built to provide it. Kellogg's regimen did not cure him. What cured him, or at least what he believed cured him, was something else entirely. While he was in Battle Creek, still sick, he encountered the mind cure ideas that were sweeping through the country in those years, the loose family of beliefs around Christian Science and New Thought that held that illness was, at bottom, a disorder of the mind, and that a person who corrected their thinking could correct their body. Post seized it. For a man who had spent 30 years watching his body betray his will, the idea that the will could command the body was not a theory. It was salvation. The recovery he credited did not come from Kellogg's bran and water. It came, by his own account, from a mind cure practitioner in the town, a woman working in the Christian Science tradition who taught him to treat his sickness as something the mind could refuse. Whether she healed him, or whether he simply turned a corner on his own, he left convinced that the cure had been mental, and that conviction became the foundation of everything. It also made him an enemy. The doctor whose sanitarium had failed to cure him, John Harvey Kellogg, would spend the next 2 decades as Post's great rival, and the rivalry would define the cereal industry. Kellogg and his younger brother Will Keith Kellogg were developing their own flaked cereals in Battle Creek in exactly these years, and when Post began selling grain drinks and cereals of his own, the Kellogg camp regarded him as a thief who had walked out of their hospital with their ideas. Post regarded himself as the better salesman, and he was right. The town was about to spawn dozens of imitators, some 44 cereal companies by one count, all chasing the same boxed breakfast gold rush. Post had arrived first at the thing that actually mattered, which was not the recipe, but the pitch. He recovered enough to leave, and he did not leave quietly. He opened his own rival institution in Battle Creek, a boarding house of health he called La Vita Inn, where he treated others with the mind cure gospel that had rescued him. He wrote a book laying out the philosophy. Its title was a small manifesto in itself. He called it, "I Am Well." Sit with that title for a moment, because it is the whole man. Not, "I want to be well," not, "I hope to be well." "I am well," declared as an act of will, by a man whose body had been failing him since he was young and would eventually kill him. He had turned his own sickness into a product, and the product was certainty. He walked out of Battle Creek not cured, but converted. And what he did with that conversion, in a white barn on the edge of that same town, would make him one of the richest men in America within 15 years. If you have made it this far, a single tap on subscribe is worth more to a channel like this than you might guess. It asks nothing of you, and it changes everything on this end. Chapter 3. There's a Reason. On the 1st of January 1895, in a little white barn in Battle Creek, Charles William Post started making a drink. It was not coffee. That was the entire point. The wellness movement Post had just come through treated coffee as a poison, a source of the jangled nerves and bad digestion that filled the sanitarium beds. And Post had a replacement. He roasted wheat and bran and a bit of molasses into a dark, grain-based drink that looked enough like coffee to sit in the same cup. and carried none of the guilt. He called it postum. He mixed the first batches himself, peddled them himself, and began, almost immediately, to do the thing he was actually a genius at: not manufacturing, advertising. Because Post's real invention was never the food, it was the sentence. He understood, decades before most of American business caught up to him, that what sold a boxed product was not the thing in the box, but the promise printed on it. Postum was not sold as a drink. It was sold as a decision to be healthy, a small daily act of self-improvement, a way to quiet what his advertisements called coffee nerves. He gave it a slogan that is still one of the most quietly effective ever written. 3 words: there's a reason. He rarely bothered to say what the reason was. He did not need to. The phrase did the work, implying evidence, implying science, implying that behind this humble drink stood some solid and reassuring fact. 2 years later, in 1897, he did it again, with a cereal. He baked wheat and barley into hard nuggets, gave them a name that had nothing to do with either grape or nut, and called them grape nuts. And he sold them the way he sold everything, wrapped in health claims that grew bolder every year. Grape nuts would sharpen the mind. Grape nuts would firm the teeth. In his most confident advertisements, grape nuts could help cure appendicitis, a claim so aggressive that it eventually collided with the law. When the magazine Collier's Weekly went after the patent medicine style of health advertising, Post was a natural target, and a fight over the appendicitis claim ended in a libel judgment against him, a fine of $50,000, later overturned on appeal. He treated the whole episode as a cost of doing business and kept advertising. There is something genuinely modern in what he had grasped. He was building a brand, in the sense the 20th century would come to understand the word, at a time when most food was still sold loose from barrels and sacks with no name attached at all. A box with a name on it, a promise on the label, and the same 3 words repeated in every magazine in the country was a new kind of machine for making money. And Post ran it better than almost anyone alive. The product was democratic in the plainest way. A box of grape nuts cost a few cents and sat on the breakfast tables of ordinary working families across the country, in kitchens that would never see the inside of a sanitarium. The money came in faster than almost anyone had seen. He added a cornflake, first under the biblical name Elijah's Manna, which offended enough churchgoers that he renamed it Post Toasties. He built the Postum cereal company from a barn into an industrial concern, and he plowed a fortune back into advertising, spending on the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to keep his 3 words in front of the country. Within about a decade, the company was worth millions, and Post was rich beyond anything his collapsing younger self could have imagined. Something in the shape of this is hard to look away from. A man whose defining experience was his own uncurable sickness built an empire selling other people the confidence that they could be well. He was not a fraud, exactly. He believed it. He had staked his own recovery on the belief. But there was a hollow place at the center of the fortune, and it was the same hollow place that had always been there. The promise worked on millions of strangers. It made him one of the wealthiest men in the country, and it could not do the one thing he most needed it to do, which was to make the man who wrote the promise well. The fortune could buy almost anything. By the standards of the age, it could buy nearly everything. It bought private trains and grand houses and a piece of Texas the size of a small nation. It could not buy the thing he had built it on. Chapter 4. Reign and Empire. To see how completely Charles Post believed that a strong enough will could bend the physical world, look at what he did to a stretch of West Texas. In 1906 and 1907, at the height of his wealth, Post bought an enormous tract of land on the plains of Garza and Lynn counties, some 225,000 acres of it, and set out to build a town from nothing. He named it, without much modesty, Post City. He laid out the streets, planted trees along them, put up neat houses and a hotel and a cotton mill, and sold or leased the land to settlers under careful rules. No saloons, no brothels. It was to be a model community, a clean and orderly place built to his specifications. An entire town organized around one man's idea of how life should be lived. By the standards of company towns in that era, which were often grim places of debt and control, Post City was meant to be genuinely humane, a town where a working family could own its own home and raise its children in order and sobriety. In this, as in everything, Post was selling a promise. Only now the product was a whole way of living on the land, and the buyer was an entire population. The plains had one problem that no amount of planning could fix. They were dry. And so Post, being Post, decided to fix the weather. This is the part of the story that sounds invented and is not. Post believed in a theory, popular in that era, that battles produced rain, that the concussion of heavy gunfire in wartime shook moisture out of the sky. So he tested it. Across several years, on the bluffs near his town, his men set off enormous charges of dynamite, sometimes kites carrying explosives into the air, sometimes rows of charges along the rim of the cap rock, timed to go off in sequence, hour after hour, a private artillery war fought against a clear Texas sky. He spent tens of thousands of dollars on these rain battles. He believed and reported that they worked a fair share of the time, though the honest reading of the record is that the rain that fell would very likely have fallen anyway. He kept at it for years regardless, undeterred by the obvious problem that the sky does not answer to conviction. That, more than the dynamite, is the revealing part. A cooler man would have run the experiment, weighed the results, and stopped. Post ran it, decided it had worked, and continued, because the alternative was admitting that there was a piece of the world his will could not command, and admitting that was the one thing he seemed constitutionally unable to do. I keep returning to the image of it because it is the purest expression of the man. Here is someone who had built a fortune on the idea that the will could command the body, standing on a Texas bluff, commanding the sky itself to give up its rain, at the cost of a small fortune in dynamite. It is grandiose. It is a little mad, and it comes from exactly the same place as "I am well," the deep and desperate conviction that reality would yield if you pushed against it hard enough with enough force and enough certainty. There was another side to that certainty, and it was harder. Post was one of the most committed enemies of organized labor in the country. He was a national champion of what was called the open shop, the movement to keep unions out of American workplaces, and he fought strikes and boycotts with the same energy he brought to everything else, pouring money and words into the cause. And yet, in the same years, he paid his own workers well, gave them bonuses, and built decent housing for them. He wanted to be the one who decided what his workers received. What he would not accept was their power to demand it. The generosity and the hardness were not a contradiction to him. They were the same thing. He would give. He would not be compelled. He could move settlers onto empty plains. He could throw dynamite at the sky and believe he was moving the clouds. He could bend a town, a workforce, a whole piece of the map to his will. By 1914, the one thing he could not bend was the thing inside his own body. It did not answer to slogans, or to dynamite, or to certainty. And it was winning. Hit subscribe if you want the rest of this story as it comes. It costs nothing, and it keeps these going. Chapter 5. The Only Child. When Charles Post died in that upstairs room in Santa Barbara, everything he had built passed to a single person, a young woman of 27 named Marjorie Merriweather Post. She was his only child, born in Springfield, Illinois, on the 15th of March, 1887, to Post and his first wife, Ella Letitia Merriweather. She had grown up inside the making of the fortune, and in a way that was unusual for a daughter of that era, her father had let her watch. He had no son. He had this one bright, watchful girl, and he brought her close to the business in a way that would shape everything she did with the rest of her life. She saw how the company worked. She learned, at his shoulder, what it took to run the thing. Her father's last years had been complicated in the private way that money makes possible. He and Ella had divorced in 1904 after nearly 2 decades of marriage, and within weeks, Post had married again to a younger woman named Layla Young, who had been his secretary. Ella died in 1912. Marjorie was devoted to her mother, and it is a matter of record that she blamed the divorce and the loss for a great deal of her mother's decline. Though a broken heart is a thing families say, not a thing a coroner writes down. By the time Post himself died, less than 2 years later, the family that inherited him was already fractured, a daughter on one side and a second wife on the other. The death set off exactly the kind of struggle you would expect. Post's will divided the Postum Cereal Company between Marjorie and Layla. Marjorie contested it. In 1915, the two women settled out of court, and the settlement is the hinge on which the entire second half of the family fortune turns. Layla surrendered her shares in the company, by the best accounts for around $6 million, and walked away. And Marjorie Merriweather Post, at 27 years old, became the sole owner of one of the most valuable food companies in America. Now sit with the strangeness of her position, because it is the thing that defines her. She owned all of it, every share, the entire concern her father had built out of a barn, and she was not permitted to run it because she was a woman. And in 1914, a woman did not sit on the board of a major American corporation, even one she completely owned. The law and the custom of her country handed her total ownership and total exclusion in the same breath. She was, by some measures, already one of the richest people in the United States, and she was expected to hold the fortune quietly, while men she employed made the decisions. It is worth pausing on how young she was to carry it. 27, twice a mother already, her own mother 2 years in the grave, and her father freshly buried by his own hand, and on her shoulders the entire weight of a company that fed a good part of the nation its breakfast. Others her age were still being told what to do with their own small lives. She had been handed a fortune, and a set of rules designed to keep her from using it. I have thought a great deal about what that does to a person, to be handed everything and permitted to touch none of it. Some people accept it. Marjorie did not. She could not take the seat, so for the next 20 years, she took the long way around. Her first husband, a Greenwich lawyer named Edward Bennett Close, whom she had married in 1905, had given her 2 daughters and a foothold in the Eastern society her father's cereal money had not quite been able to buy. But Close was not the man to run a food empire, and the marriage did not survive the strain of who she was becoming. She married men who could sit on the board in her place, and she made sure they answered to her, and when a husband stopped being useful to the fortune tended to outlast the marriage. She learned the business through them, over them, around them, patiently, the way water learns a wall. She had inherited her father's certainty. What she did with it was quieter than dynamite, and far more effective. where he had pushed against the world head-on, with explosives and slogans and open defiance. She pushed sideways, through marriages and boardrooms and the patient accumulation of leverage, and she outlasted every obstacle the age put in front of her. The fortune had reached her across two fresh graves, her mother's and her father's, and it had reached her hobbled by the simple fact of her sex. She spent the next 59 years refusing to let either of those facts decide what the money would become, and what she made it become out of a boxed breakfast cereal was a life so grand that the country had genuinely never seen its like. Chapter 6. The Wealthiest Woman in America. For 20 years after her father died, Marjorie Merriweather Post ran the largest food company in America from a seat she was not allowed to occupy. The instrument she used for most of that stretch was her second husband. In 1920, she married Edward Francis Hutton, a Wall Street financier who had built the brokerage house that carried his name. Hutton was sharp, ambitious, and useful, and Marjorie made him chairman of the board of the Postum Cereal Company. On paper, he ran it. In practice, they ran it together, and the record makes clear that the strategic nerve, the appetite for scale, came as much from her as from him. She could not sit at the table, so she married the man who sat at the head of it, and she leaned on him from the chair beside it, and the company began to grow in a way it never had under her father. Post had built a fortune on 3 products and a slogan. His daughter built an empire by buying everyone else's. The logic was simple and modern, and it was hers as much as anyone's. A single cereal company was vulnerable, one product line away from trouble. A company that owned dozens of the most trusted names in the American pantry was something else entirely. A machine too broad to fail on any one shelf. Through the 1920s, Postum went on a campaign of acquisition that reshaped the American kitchen. Jell-O came in, Baker's chocolate came in, Maxwell House coffee, Log Cabin syrup, Calumet baking powder, Swan's Down cake flour, one famous name after another, until the company was no longer a cereal maker, but something new. A diversified giant that reached into nearly every cupboard in the country. And then came the deal that gave the company its name, and it came from Marjorie herself on the deck of a boat. She was cruising on one of the yachts that carried her between her houses in the middle of the 1920s when she was served a meal of goose that had been killed, dressed, quick frozen, and then stored for months before it was thawed and cooked. It should not have been remarkable, but it was extraordinary. The goose tasted fresh. She asked how, and the answer led her to a man named Clarence Birdseye, a Brooklyn inventor who had cracked the problem of flash-freezing food so fast that the ice crystals stayed small and the texture survived. Marjorie tasted the future in that goose, and she pushed hard for the company to buy Birdseye's operation. The men around her hesitated. The price was enormous, more than $20 million, and frozen food was an unproven idea in a country that had no freezers to keep it in. She insisted. In 1929, the company bought Birdseye, and to hold a business that was now so much larger than breakfast, it took a new name. It became the General Foods Corporation. It is the most telling moment in her whole business life, and it is worth slowing down for. She was not, in that decade, permitted to be a director. She was, by the arrangements of the age, a shareholder whose husband held the seat. And it was her palate, her instinct, and her insistence that put the frozen food revolution inside the largest food company in America, over the caution of the men who were officially in charge. The single most important strategic decision in the company's history came from the one person in the room the rules said should not be deciding anything. The marriage to Hutton did not last. It ended in 1935, in the ordinary wreckage of infidelity and grown-apart lives. But by then, something had shifted in the country and in the law, and in 1936, Marjorie Merriweather Post did the thing she had been denied for 22 years. She took a seat on the board of General Foods in her own name, not through a husband, not by proxy. As herself, the owner finally permitted to sit where the owners sat. She was 49 years old, and she had waited most of her adult life for a chair that had always, by right, been hers. There is a temptation to make her a simple heroine of that story, the woman who beat the men at their own game, and it flattens her to do it. She was not a reformer. She did not set out to change the rules for anyone but herself. She was a rich woman who wanted control of what she already owned, and she took it by the only route the age left open to her, through the men she married and past them. What she proved, without ever intending it as a lesson, was how much talent the country was wasting by keeping people like her out of the room. The frozen food revolution had to sneak into General Foods through a shareholder's palate, because the shareholder was not allowed to simply decide. Subscribing is how stories like this one keep finding their way to you. It costs nothing, and it keeps them coming. Chapter 7: Cereal Money and a Dead Czar's Crown. The year Marjorie took her board seat, she also married a man who would carry her further from a Battle Creek barn than she had ever been, all the way to Moscow, at the worst possible moment to be rich and the best possible moment to be a collector. His name was Joseph Davies, a Washington lawyer of considerable ambition, and he became her third husband late in 1935. Within a year, President Roosevelt appointed him United States Ambassador to the Soviet Union, and in 1936, the two of them arrived in Moscow to represent America to Joseph Stalin's government. Marjorie Merriweather Post, heiress to Postum and grape nuts, took up residence in the capital of world communism, and what she found there was the estate sale of a murdered empire. You have to understand what the Soviet government was doing with money in those years to understand what happened next. Stalin was driving a brutal, breakneck industrialization, and it needed hard currency, foreign money, more than it needed almost anything else. And the new regime was sitting on the confiscated treasure of the world it had overthrown, the palaces and cathedrals and private collections of the Romanovs, and the aristocracy, and the Orthodox Church, gold and silver and icons and jeweled objects with no place in a worker's state. So they sold it. Quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, the Soviet government put the treasures of Imperial Russia on the market to raise cash, and a well-placed foreigner with taste and money could acquire for modest sums objects that had once belonged to emperors. Marjorie had both the taste and the money, and she was standing in exactly the right place. She began to buy chalices and icons, silver and porcelain, the jeweled work of the court goldsmith Fabergé, and in time, objects of real historical enormity, including a nuptial crown said to have been worn by the last empress, Alexandra, at her wedding to the last Tsar. Piece by piece, over the Moscow years and for decades after, she assembled what became the greatest collection of Russian imperial art outside Russia itself. Hold this image still for a moment, because it is one of the strangest transactions of the century, and it happened almost quietly. The wedding crown of an empress who had been shot in a cellar with her whole family, sold by the government that shot her to raise money for its factories, and bought by the daughter of an American cereal salesman to be shipped across an ocean and eventually shown to school children in Washington. The distance between a box of Post Toasties on a working family's breakfast table and a Romanov crown in a display case is almost too great to measure. Marjorie Merriweather Post closed that distance in a single lifetime, with breakfast money. There is a way of telling this that makes her a vulture, picking over the bones of a slaughtered dynasty. There is another way that makes her a rescuer, preserving beauty that a hostile state was ready to melt down or sell for scrap. The honest answer is that she was both, and that she seems to have understood it. She was not naive about where the objects came from. She kept meticulous records. She studied what she bought. She treated the collection with the seriousness of a curator rather than a hoarder. And she arranged, long before she died, that all of it would one day belong to the public. By the standards of the great American collectors of her age, men who bought European masterpieces to hang in private galleries no stranger would ever enter, this was an unusually public-minded kind of acquisition. She was gathering the objects, but she had decided early that she was gathering them for a museum, not a vault. The Empress's crown would not disappear into a private vault. It would end up in a museum, with her name on the door, and the Empress's ghost in the glass. There is one more thing worth saying about how she bought. She did not haggle in back rooms or smuggle. She acquired much of it openly, through official Soviet channels set up precisely to sell the old world for hard currency, and through the dealers who worked that trade. The strangeness is not that she did something secret. The strangeness is that all of it was permitted, even encouraged, by a government that needed the money, so that the jeweled eggs and the chalices and the crown crossed from a communist state to an American heiress through the front door. The marriage to Davies lasted through the war and ended in 1955. What it left behind was not a happy union, but a collection without equal, and a woman who had turned a diplomatic posting into the acquisition of a lost empire's crown jewels. She had made cereal into the treasure of the czars. On a strip of Florida sand between an ocean and a lake, she had already built the place where a fortune like that could finally sit still. Chapter 8. Mar-a-Lago. Between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth, on a barrier island in Palm Beach, Florida, Marjorie Merriweather Post built a house so large and so strange that a century later it would be one of the most famous private addresses in the world. She built it before the Moscow years, between 1924 and 1927, in the flush of the Hutton marriage and the growing General Foods fortune. She named it Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake, for the 17 acres of sand it sat on, reaching from the ocean on one side to the lake on the other. She hired the architect Marion Sims Wyeth for the bones of it, and the Viennese designer Joseph Urban, a man who had built sets for the Ziegfeld Follies, for the flourishes. Between them, they produced something that was less a house than a stage set for a way of life. Well over 100 rooms, a tower, cloisters, imported stone, gold leaf, a dining room modeled on a Florentine palace. She spent around $7 million on it in the money of the 1920s, a sum that would run well past $100 million today. Sit for a moment with what that house actually was, because it is the whole family compressed into stone. It was a breakfast fortune turned into a palace. Every dollar in those cloisters had come, ultimately, from boxes of cereal and jars of instant coffee sold a few cents at a time to ordinary people. Charles Post had built the fortune selling health to the many. His daughter had gathered it up and poured it into a monument to the few, a private Versailles on a sandbar, filled eventually with the treasures of dead emperors. The everyman product and the imperial house stood at opposite ends of the same 50 years, connected by one family and a great deal of will. The house was not her only monument, and by the standards of ordinary wealth, none of them made any sense at all. There was the yacht, In 1931, she launched a four-masted sailing ship, built in Germany to her own exacting specifications, that was at the time the largest privately owned sailing yacht in the world. She had studied the engineering herself. She had the interiors mocked up full size in a warehouse so she could walk through them before they were built. She named it, eventually, the Sea Cloud, and it was a floating estate, a great white ship carrying a serial heiress across the oceans of a world sliding toward war. And here the fortune brushed up against history in a way she could not have planned. When the United States entered the Second World War, the Navy needed ships, and it took the Sea Cloud into service. Stripped of its masts and painted gray, the largest private sailing yacht in the world became a weather and patrol vessel. And in a detail that outshines almost everything else about it, the Sea Cloud, under a commanding officer named Carlton Skinner, became one of the first racially integrated warships in the United States military since the Civil War, with black and white sailors serving together, decades before the armed forces as a whole were desegregated. A pleasure ship built with serial money became, for a few years, a small and quiet experiment in a fairer America. The yacht was not even the whole of it.
In New York, she kept a triplex apartment atop a Fifth Avenue building, dozens of rooms in the sky, described by people who studied such things as very possibly the largest and most lavish apartment ever built in the city, with its own private elevator entrance and cold rooms to store her furs and her flowers. In the Adirondacks, she kept a great rustic camp of dozens of buildings, each guest cabin with its own attendant. She lived, in other words, across a small archipelago of monuments, moving among them by private railcar and private ship, a serial fortune spread across the map in stone and timber and sail. I keep coming back to how public all of this was. There is a version of great wealth that hides, that buries itself in trusts and shell companies and unlisted addresses, that does not want to be seen. Marjorie Merriweather Post was the opposite of that. Her houses were landmarks, her yacht was famous, her parties were reported in every society column in the country, her face was in the magazines. She was, for decades, simply the most visible rich woman in America, and she seems to have wanted it that way. Whatever this family was, it was not hidden. There is a question that hangs over a house like that, and it is worth asking plainly. What is a person trying to outlast when they build on such a scale? Her father had thrown dynamite at the sky to force the weather to obey him. The daughter built in stone and gold on a sandbar between an ocean and a lake, filled it with the treasures of dead emperors, and meant it to stand for centuries. The same family will that could not save Charles Post from himself ran straight through his daughter into her monuments, the refusal to accept limits, the determination to bend even time. She built Mar-a-Lago to last, and she made a decision about its future that tells you exactly how she saw herself. She would not let it become just another rich family's house, sold off and forgotten. She meant it to belong to the country. She meant it, specifically, to become a retreat for presidents, a winter White House, given as a gift to the American people. What happened to that wish after she died is the strangest turn in the entire story. If you have come this far into the fine grain of a family most of the country only half remembers, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribe, and I will keep making them. Chapter 9. What She Left and What Was Given Back. Marjorie Merriweather Post died at Hillwood, her estate in Washington, on the 12th of September, 1973. She was 86 years old, and she died the way many people hope to and few manage. Old, unhurried, in her own grand house, at the far end of a long and astonishing life. Hold that fact against the word
curse for a moment, because it matters. The founder of this family shot himself at 59. His daughter, the person who actually carried the fortune across the century, lived to 86 and died in her sleep of the ordinary failures of a very old body. Her daughters would live longer still. There was no gunfire in her generation, no mysterious death, nothing the legend needs to feed on. There was a long life, lived almost entirely in the open, and a quiet and ordinary end. What she did with the years before that end was give nearly everything away, on purpose, and in daylight. She had spent her life as one of the great American philanthropists, funding the Red Cross and hospitals and the arts and feeding programs through the Depression. And as she approached the end, she turned that same instinct on her own monuments. Hillwood, the Washington estate, with its incomparable Russian and French collections, she arranged to leave to the public as a museum. And a museum it became, opening its doors a few years after her death exactly as she had planned. The treasures of the Tsars, the Empress's crown, the Fabergé, all of it, went on display for anyone who cared to buy a ticket. She had spent a fortune gathering beauty, and she spent her last energy making sure the public would inherit it. And then there was Mar-a-Lago, and the strange comedy of what became of her grandest wish. She left the great Palm Beach house to the United States government, exactly as she had intended, to serve as a winter White House, a retreat for presidents. It was a magnificent gift, and the government did not want it. The house was enormous. The upkeep ran to something like $1 million a year, and no president in the 1970s had any appetite for being seen wintering in a 100-room oceanfront palace. The government held it, uneasily, for a few years, and then gave it back. In 1980, Congress returned Mar-a-Lago to the Post Foundation. The gift politely declined. For a few years, the greatest house on the island sat in an awkward limbo, too grand to keep and too significant to tear down. And then, in 1985, it was bought by a New York real estate developer named Donald Trump, who turned it eventually into a private club, and who, decades after that, as President of the United States, would use Mar-a-Lago as his winter residence, the place he retreated to and governed from through the Florida season. Consider what that means against her intention, because it is one of the strangest ironies I know of in American life. Marjorie Merriweather Post built Mar-a-Lago to be a winter White House. She gave it to the nation for exactly that purpose. The nation said no and handed it back. And then, by a route she could never have imagined and might not have chosen, through a private sale to a developer who would himself become president, the house became a winter White House after all. Her wish was granted, decades late, in a form utterly unlike the gift she had offered. The monument outlived the woman and slipped free of everything she had planned for it, and became famous in the 21st century for reasons that have nothing to do with cereal. The other monuments went the same way, given rather than hoarded. The Great Adirondack Camp passed toward the state of New York. The largest sailing yacht in the world had long since left her hands and sailed on under other flags, including, for a while, a Caribbean dictator's. Her jewels, the diamonds, and the historic pieces, she directed toward the national collections in Washington, where some of them sit today among the crown treasures of the Republic. A woman could hardly have arranged a more complete handing over of her own splendor to the public that had, cent by cent, paid for it. General Foods followed the same path out of the family's hands. The giant she and Hutton had assembled was bought by Philip Morris in 1985 for more than $5.5 billion, and folded in time into Kraft. The Post name came off the corporate masthead, and yet it survived where it had started, on the cereal boxes, on the grape nuts, and the post-toasties that outlived every owner and every merger, the founder's name still printed on the most ordinary shelf in the American grocery store. She left almost nothing hidden and almost everything on display. The museum, the collection, the houses, the whole visible architecture of a very public life, which is the precise opposite of a family with secrets. And it is time, in the last chapter, to say so plainly. Chapter 10. The Curse That Was Never There. There is a version of the Post family that lives in headlines and half-remembered talk, and in that version, they are cursed. You can find the word attached to them, the way it attaches to any rich family a suicide has touched. A dynasty haunted by the founder's violent death, shadowed by secrets, its fortune carrying some hidden cost. It is a satisfying shape. It has the old outline of the rich punished by fate for the sin of being rich. And when you hold it against the actual record, it very nearly falls apart in your hands. Let me stop the chronology here, because the tour is over, and what is left is the thing underneath it. It would be easy to say that the Post fortune was cursed, that the cereal money carried a punishment folded inside it, that the family paid in blood for what the founder built. That is the version the legend offers. This is not the story of a bloodline stalked by suicide across the generations. It is the story of one man, sick and despairing at the end of a hard life, who ended it in a single upstairs room, and of a daughter and granddaughters who then lived long, loud, public, and mostly fortunate lives on the money he left. One death, and a great deal of life around it. What strikes me, having walked the whole length of it, is that the money did not curse this family, it magnified them. A suicide in a poor family is a private grief that the neighbors half remember. A suicide at the head of one of the great American fortunes becomes a legend that outlives everyone who knew the man and gathers to itself rumors of secrets and curses that the plain facts never supported. The fortune did not bring the darkness down on them. It put the one real sorrow they had under 100 years of magnifying glass, until a single sick man in a single room came to stand for a whole doomed dynasty that never actually existed. What survived was almost everything, and almost all of it in plain sight. The collection survived in a public museum with the Empress's crown behind glass. The houses survived, one of them the most famous private residence in the country. The names survived on the cereal boxes and on a Texas town and on the great white yacht still sailing somewhere under other owners. What did not survive was the secrecy the legend requires, because there never was any. Every important thing this family did, from the founder's death to the daughter's collection to the fate of the great house, happened in the open, in the newspapers, in the society columns, and eventually in the museums. And what did not survive, for the man at the beginning of it, was the one thing his whole philosophy had promised: the ability to think himself well. He had built a fortune telling strangers that the mind could master the body, and in a single upstairs room, on a spring morning in 1914, his own mind and his own body reached the end of that argument together. So go back to that upstairs room, one last time. Montecito, in the hills above Santa Barbara, a little before noon on the 9th of May, 1914. A man of 59, home from a surgery that did not fix him, alone with a rifle and a pain that his own gospel of health could not touch. In a moment there will be a gunshot, and the country will read about it over breakfast the next morning. On the first pass, that room is the beginning of a curse, the first of the suicides and secrets, the opening shot of a doomed line. By now you know what it actually is. It is the only shot. It is one sick and despairing man, at the end of a fortune built on the promise that a person could decide to be well, unable in the end to decide it for himself. Everything the legend piled on afterward, the secrets, the cursed bloodline, the generations of tragedy, was hung on this one afternoon, because a fortune that large and a family that public are easier to look at if you can tell yourself that fate was charging them for it. There was one gunshot, in one room, above one California town, and the papers carried it plainly the next morning.
Everything else, the curse and the secrets and the doomed bloodline, we added later, because a fortune that big is easier to look at if the family that built it was paying for it. This is the kind of work this channel exists for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.